The fall of 1609, Henry Hudson entered the mouth of what would become the Hudson River. At the time, however, he called it the Great River among the mountains. He wrote in his journals, "It is as fine a river as can be found, wide and deep, with good anchoring on both sides." 2 decades later, this great river would become the anchor of New Netherlands, the Dutch colonial establishment in the New World. By 1664, it would be renamed New York. Of course, that is a colonial name. And for more than 2 centuries before Europeans arrived, it was known as Lenape Country. So in this first lecture, we'll be talking about the Lenape people, an indigenous tribe along the Atlantic seaboard. We'll go into how the Lenape society was structured, what set Lenape society apart from the European colonial society that had begun to colonize this area by 1609. Also, there's different views of the land. Of course, Europeans viewed the land in strictly economic terms, whereas Lenape people viewed the land a little bit different. So we'll get into the ambiguities with that. Then we'll talk a little bit about the first impressions that Europeans had of these Lenape people, which set the stage for historical writing about the Lenape people, much of which kind of structures what we know about the Lenape people. And then finally, we'll talk about geography and how geography really shaped the future development of what would become New York City. First, we'll begin by a little prehistory of New York, or what becomes known as New York. And the history of this area really begins around 50,000 years ago, when a giant ice sheet had literally covered most of what is now North America. This giant ice sheet that covered North America was over 1,000 feet thick. And as you can imagine, this is very, very heavy, an immense weight. And so as this ice sheet is moving down from the north, it's dragging all the boulders, all the trees, all the flora, all across and pushing it down towards the Atlantic seaboard. And as this ice sheet is coming down from the north, it's depressing riverbeds, it's scooping out valleys, it's dragging along boulders, gravel, all kinds of sand and clay and sediment, and it's acting like a huge conveyor belt towards the Atlantic Ocean. For example, in parts of what we now know as Manhattan and the Bronx, it peeled away almost everything above bedrock. That's why you can go to Central Park today and find, large pieces of exposed bedrock. And this bedrock is primarily comprised of marble and schist that is over 500 million years old. And you can see it with the naked eye today, which is really remarkable. And you can see part of the stages of this giant glacier progress on the chart to the left. So the early stages, as we said, this giant glacier that sweeps down from the north, really, acting as a conveyor belt, bringing all the gravel, boulders, depressing the riverbeds and valleys. And then as we progress, we start to see an ebb due to climate change. So about 17,000 years ago, the climate in the northern hemisphere began to warm, right? And so this giant glacier begins to melt back, and you can see that in the stages C through E. It wasn't until about 6,000 years ago that small game hunters and foragers began subsisting on this now exposed fertile land. And these are the very first traces of the people we now know as the Lenape indigenous people. So by the time Henry Hudson and the Dutch start to colonize this area, there were more than 15,000 inhabitants already living here. Okay, and they didn't call it New York, of course. The Dutch didn't even call it New York, but they called it Manhattan. And that's not the extent of it. There are about 30,000, adjacent tribes in the surrounding area in what is now today is New Jersey and also Connecticut. And so this is a vastly populated area. It's far from the pristine, uninhabited land that people of the historians of the 19th century had imagined. Most of the people in this area spoke a dialect, a language called Munsee, which is a dialect of the larger Delaware language, which was associated with the Algonquin Native American tribes. So the people living in what becomes New York called themselves Lenape, and in the Delaware language, that means literally men or people. And the land where they settled, they called Lenapehoking, which means where the Lenapes live, most literally. And for the purposes of our class this semester, we're going to be focusing on this southern tip of a small island peninsula here that the Lenape people called Mannahatta. And in the Lenape language, that means the land of many hills, right? As we'll see when we get into the geography of this landscape and how it shapes what becomes New York City. Archaeological research in the past century has revealed more than 80 Lenape inhabited sites throughout the 5 boroughs of what is now New York City. And within that geographical landscape, there's more than 24 planting fields and an intricate network of paths and trails that lace these all together. So again, it was not this pristine, uninhabited landscape, but rather a vibrant and bustling society that the European colonists found when they arrived in the 1620s. On the island of Manhattan, there was a very large and broad, if you will, trail that connected most major sites on that island. And this long trail ran from all along the island's breadth from north to south, from what is now Battery Park all the way up to Inwood. Okay, and this major thoroughfare back in the Lenape times, is still used today, but it's called Broadway. So next time you're in New York City, go to Broadway, and you'll realize that it doesn't follow the grid pattern that most streets in New York City follow. It actually bisects those and goes through them, partly because it's mapped onto this Native American Lenape thoroughfare that had existed even before the colonists had arrived in the New World. Lenapes were both matrilineal, meaning that women held particular status and leadership in their society, and nomadic. When we say nomadic, we mean that these are people on the move, right? So to find easy access to fish, shellfish, game birds, and deer, sources of animal protein that compensated for the lack of domestic livestock, the Lenape people kept moving and establishing so many different settlements throughout this island of Manhattan. So moving from one place to the next every few months really discouraged the accumulation of property, which accounts for their perspective of land not as property and not as an economic tool, but something that is held in common. Okay? The Lenapes view land that is something that should be held in common for the betterment of most people in the society. And this is starkly different from the view of land that the European colonizers bring to the New World. Dutch fur traders, for example, soon discovered that native peoples didn't want iron pots to trade because they're too heavy, right? It would be, overburdensome because they're always on the move, right? When the European colonizers came to this New World, they viewed the land as kind of pristine, if you will. And part of that was due to some of the spiritual beliefs and social practices among the Lenape people. The Lenape people were extremely spiritual, and they believed on an interdependence of life between them and the surrounding environment. For example, hunting was an enterprise that was loaded with spirituality, and the significance that excessive killing was strictly to be avoided. Right? So they only killed in order to subsist on the land as well. And so when the Europeans came over here, they saw a land that was replete with animal wildlife, right? Which gave them the impression that it had been untouched by the Native Americans. But it was touched, right? It's just that the Native Americans, the Lenape people specifically, did not overhunt the area, right? Because they didn't need to. They didn't need to trade furs, right? They only hunted, this wildlife in order to eat it, right? They didn't need to accumulate property and trade it. They didn't have that kind of society. That's so different than the European society that came over here. Lenape society was structured around kinship, not class. It's another major difference between the Lenape society and the Dutch and English societies that come over in the 1620s and 1640s. So kinship was the basis of Lenape society, right? Private ownership of land and their hierarchical relations of domination and exploitation, familiar to Europe, were unknown to the Lenape people. Kinship in Lenape society was traced matrilineally, meaning through the mother. Okay? Families at each location were grouped into clans within the Lenape society, right? Traced their descent from a single female ancestor generations before. And this is how land was allocated within Lenape society. So land was assigned to specific clans that descended from specific, female ancestors. So the land existed for the families to utilize, right? Not to own, right? They had no conception of owning something as we do in the Western society. That was totally foreign to them. So they did not own the land as the Europeans understood, the ownership of property, and they had no authority to dispose of it by sale, okay, or bequest. Okay? They couldn't leave the land to someone else. It just, it existed, and it was used throughout families. If the land belonged to anyone in the Lenape society, it belonged to the inhabitants collectively, okay? This, again, points to this concept that the Lenape people viewed the land very differently than the European colonizers. This is going to be very, very important when we start to see the first European colonizers come over and establish a trading post at the southern tip of Manhattan. We can trace the European colonization in North America back before even Columbus, landed on Hispaniola, what is now Cuba. In 1524, King Francis I of France commissioned an Italian sailor named Giovanni di Verrazzano to find a northern route to China and Japan, the same Indies that Columbus had dreamed of finding. Okay, except that Giovanni di Verrazzano was going to take a northern route, whereas Columbus attempted to take a southern route. Unfortunately, Verrazzano's exploration of this northern route concluded that the Eastern Passage did not lead to China, right? This is something that Hudson had to discover a little bit later. While there was no northwest passage to China, Europeans found the fur trade. And this is something that was hugely lucrative for the European colonizers. Furs had always figured prominently in European luxury and trades. Beaver, in particular, a kind of exotic commodity from the New World, was highly prized, both as for its soft, deep fur, but its alleged medicinal properties as well. Okay? In the 17th century, Dutch physicist and chemist Adrian van Donk alleged that beaver oil could cure rheumatism. It could cure toothaches. It could cure stomach aches. It could cure pure vision. It could cure dizziness, right? He said that beaver testicles, actually, when rubbed on the forehead or dried and dissolved in water, made an effective antidote to drowsiness or idiocy, right? However, the greatest utility of beaver skins had to do with the fact that it was both water repellent and warm at the same time. So it made for good clothes and good coats in particular. But we'll be covering the European colonization of North America and Manhattan more specifically in the next lecture. So for now, some of the key terms are this idea of Manhattan and what does that mean in the Lenape language. What does it mean to have a nomadic society? And for that matter, what is a matrilineal society? And also, for the midterm exam, you also needed to identify Giovanni di Verrazzano and how his life contributed to exploration in North America.